So today's topic is about knowing students. It's a key pedagogical imperative in teacher education, but it's also a pedagogical imperative in lots of different domains in which people are responsible for educating or working with other people. The idea is we have to, in order to impact someone, in order to, especially in the teacher context, in order to help someone learn, the idea is we have to know them. Right? So as a key pedagogical imperative, you have to know your students. For today, we read a chapter from my book, Critical Educational Psychology, which was intended to problematize this imperative, not lead us to reject it wholesale, but to think about the complexities with this imperative. So to get us thinking about that, I'm going to show you this. This is from one of your classmates' logs. Your classmate asked the question, is labeling a part of the injustice within the education system of America? Right? And this question, if you think about the lines of critical theorizing, sociohistoricism, emancipation, and polyvocalism, this question certainly speaks more to the emancipation. The question is, does labeling help to mitigate injustice? Does it help to perpetuate injustice? And labeling is a key part of knowing students. Whenever, like any effort to know students involves naming them, describing them, categorizing them, right? And those are all labels. Even something we take for granted, such as self-esteem, is a psychological label, right? ADD, but we also have other like more medicalized labels such as ADD, neurological disorders, etc. Right? There's lots of different ways to label students. We have grit, right? Growth mindset. There are some that are more explicitly problematic, some that are way more subtly problematic. But this is a key question with which critical theorists engage, with anyone really in education, psychology. Is labeling part of the injustice within the education system of America? And to reflect on this question, really think about Sugarman's conceptualization of social justice. How might different visions for social justice, how might it align with labeling? Does labeling make sense for some visions? Does it make sense for, or does it not make sense for other visions? Because some folks would argue, right? If we take two ends of the spectrum, some folks would argue that labeling is problematic, right? It could lead to pathologizing people who may not have pathologies. Whereas other folks would say labeling is necessary to support educational success. If someone has ADD, for example, we need to identify that person and give them the right kinds of interventions so that person could be successful. So I think you could see really compelling arguments on both sides of this, right? But just to note, I really think that's an important question with which to grapple. But in my chapter, I'm not actually trying to answer this, right? I'm more trying to understand, why are we labeling people a certain way? Not necessarily it's going to lead to them to be emancipated or oppressed, but more so, what's the historical, ideological reasons for why we're labeling people? Right? So not necessarily making a claim whether or not those labels are true or accurate, whether or not they oppress or emancipate. It's more so trying to understand what's the historical, cultural, political, philosophical context that make certain labels possible to apply. I'm going to get into this in a little bit. But I mean, this really speaks to, right away, we're really seeing some of the dangerous complexities with knowing students, right? Knowing students involves labeling them. And some people make compelling arguments that labeling can mitigate injustice. Some people argue that labeling can help perpetuate it, right? And again, there's really compelling arguments for both sides of that. And so, what I was planning to have us a review, it's really important to always review this distinction between ed psychology and critical ed psychology and social justice, because this very much informs much of what we're doing in this course. Again, what I try to do is I present to you educational psychology discourse, and then I try to offer critical analysis of it. And this is a good time to highlight that's how the structure of the chapters are of my book that we're going to read. So when you read anything from me, from my book, Critical Ed Psychology, I typically give sort of the lay of the land in the very beginning. Say, look, this is what ed psychologists generally believe. This is the narrative. This is the paradigm within ed psychology. I present that up front in the first half of the chapter. And then in the latter part of the chapter is when I engage critically with those ideas. So when you want to capture my argument, you really need to dig into that latter part of the chapter, right? And so what I'm saying in the very beginning is not necessarily what I'm arguing, what I'm endorsing, what I'm believing. It's me presenting you the narrative within ed psychology. So then I can then say, look, this is what I'm going to be critiquing. This is what I'm going to be, this is what I'll be critiquing. So it's always, so the plan was to review ed psychology, critical ed psychology, because that's very much the framing of the course. Then we were going to have a discussion on knowing students, sorry about that typo. And then I was going to have you work with your partners on applying the lesson from today to that midterm assignment. I think it's always important. I always want to try to integrate some time during class to push you to apply what we've done to that midterm-ish assignment. And then, of course, to review and to look forward for next week. So really, I want to emphasize considering, analyzing, thinking about the distinction between ed psychology and critical ed psychology. And I was going to have us fill out a table together. If you want, you can pause here. Just take a couple of minutes and try to jot down some ideas that you have about the distinction between ed psychology and critical ed psychology. And I'll go over a couple right now. So ed psychologists, they're generally committed to, I would argue actually all of ed psychology is mostly committed to knowing students, right? One of the commitments is let's improve our models. Let's develop models, frameworks, perspectives, our instruments. Let's use empirical, right, scientifically valid methods, right, to try to understand how it is that people think, what motivates them. How do they think? How do they process information? How do they remember? How does passion develop? Perseverance, right? What affects those things? What kinds of environments are ideal for emotional development, right? Social development, right? This is what generally ed psychologists want to do, right? And it's really good, right? It's a really important task, right? So they're committed, right? So generally they're committed to using a scientific method to try to understand, articulate how we think, right? What affects us, how things affect us, what's ideal environments for our growth, what should that growth look like? So critical ed psychologist, it's very much based on ed psychology, right? It's in response to ed psychology. It's reactive to ed psychology. So what I see is I try to look at the dominant theories, ideas, frameworks, models, instrument tools from ed psychology, say, what are some issues with this? What are some problems? What are some things about it that might not be included in the discourse? Because some things may not always be problems, right? So for me, the starting point for critical ed psychology is all psychological theories, models, frameworks, instruments are bound to historical, political, cultural, and ideological contexts. Those contexts are not part of the conversation. right? And we can see this in the imperative to know students. Psychology is all about the imperative to know students, but we don't give the complexity of knowing students its due within the dominant discourse. Knowing students is highly complicated, right? And critical psychology is focused on trying to illuminate those those complexities, those dangers. So as I said, some of the tools of critical ed psychology would be those frameworks, right? The sociohistoricism, the polyvocalism, the emancipation. But could there be lots of other tools as well, lots of other commitments? But critical ed psychology is not trying to not necessarily trying to endorse, promote, validate truth claims about psychology, but more so trying to explore what leads us to form those truth claims. And I think, this will make I think we'll try to contextualize this, and I think it will make a little more sense in the context of knowing students, but also we'll continuously try to situate ed psychology within those contexts throughout this course. So knowing students, it's a foundational pedagogical imperative. What I was hoping, right, generally, for many, knowing students is generally seen as unequivocally good for teaching. What I would hope is after reading my chapter, again, you don't always have to agree with what I'm saying, but what I would hope is from reading a chapter, you might be a little less reluctant to put a true here. I was hoping more of a false or it depends, right? Because again, if you think about the binary, knowing students versus not knowing them, right? Not knowing them, very problematic, right? Knowing them, also problematic. Oftentimes, though, when we have a binary, and in that binary, one opposite is really unappealing, we might be inclined to accept it's opposite, right? It's binary. We can see that play out so much in ed psychology, right? Knowing students versus not knowing them. Okay, not knowing them is bad. So yeah, we should commit unequivocally to knowing students, right? We can see this like in growth mindset and fixed mindset. Fixed mindset, very bad mindset. So we should accept growth mindset. And I say, yeah, I don't know. Grit, right? Hard work, perseverance, right? The opposite of that would be stagnation, complacency, giving up, right? All these things that we find to be very negative, right? So yeah, of course we don't want to promote that in children. So yeah, we should accept grit. I'd argue we don't have to be governed and bound to those binaries. And I'll continue pushing, right, trying to break away from those binaries. All right, so knowing students, right? So just because not knowing students is probably not a good idea doesn't mean doesn't necessarily mean we should accept the imperative to know students as unequivocally good for teaching. I was also going to have us think about compile ways of knowing students. Again, here you can think about what are the different ways we can know students, because there's lots of them. I covered 3 of them in that chapter, but there are several, right? And some that we won't even identify as knowing students. But there are lots, right? I identify 3, like, in terms of grit, right? We can know students by measuring how gritty they are to determine how gritty they are. Right? We could think about students in terms of data points for all these graphs. We give them assessments and we graph their improvement over time using graphs on assessments, right? That's a very common practice in schools today, right? Give assessments over time, see and track improvements, right? And students become data points. Some folks at one student talked about, using the notion at risk. We use lots of concepts, labels, and terms, right, to know students, to identify them. This one's at risk. This one's not at risk, right? This one's gritty. This one's not gritty, right? Emotional intelligence. We use intelligence, emotional intelligence. We have these multiple intelligences, right? Musical intelligence, right? We have all these labels, frameworks, in which we can know students. And sometimes they're not even formally part of frameworks. Sometimes we can personality can be part of frameworks too. Language, and that can also be part of frameworks. But these are all ways of knowing students, right? Understanding linguistic practices, their personality, if that exists, right? We have all these different labels, concepts, models, frameworks that we use to know students. Learning styles is another popular one. Um, Try to identify person's learning styles. And then we could try to even individualize that a little bit, but there's never ever really a totally individualizing of students, right? When people talk about individualizing students, we're often trying to locate difference among students within a framework. So for example, like learning styles, there's only 3 different learning styles, right? Again, some people question whether or not those really exist. Okay, but there's only 3 different learning styles. And so, in an effort to individualize person in terms of learning styles, you got to locate them in 1 and 3 different styles. So you're individualizing as well as, I'd say, totalizing, homogenizing, universalizing, right? You're saying, you might be different, but you're only different um, in this, within a well-defined framework. There's only 3 possibilities for you here, right? We can see that with lots of different frameworks, right? So again, whenever we try to individualize stuff, we are using totalizing frameworks. All right, anyway, that's just a side point. Ways of knowing students, lots of different ways. All right, so then the question is, all right, yes, imperatives, you have to know students, lots of different ways to know them. It may serve them well or it may not serve them well, right? These are the kinds of ideas we've been throwing around so far. All right, so then what is the main argument point of this chapter on knowing students? So here, I'm not sure why it's, oh, there it goes. Teachers should try to know students the best, and you don't have to obviously fill this in, right? I was going to do this in class. Teachers should try to know students the best they can because that knowledge is the foundation of good teaching. Problems with knowing students will result from invalid assessments and measurements. The acts of knowing students involves the use of historically, philosophically, and culturally specific language and tools. Students have a true self that can be known using scientific tools. So if you had to identify what I would be arguing, if you chose C, then you are correct. I'm not arguing A, B, C, or D. I actually find each of those to be troublesome and problematic. And for lots of different reasons. And so really what I'm trying to show is any way of knowing students, it's historical, philosophical, cultural. It depends on the language we have and the tools we have. So we know students using culturally specific, historically specific, philosophically specific instruments. Again, that doesn't mean it's good or bad, right? Doesn't mean that. That's not what I'm saying. Although one can make a good argument for certain things being good or bad, right? That's not what I'm arguing. What I'm trying to say is when we label, identify, when we know people, when we're trying to know students a certain way, we're doing it because of what's available to us, not because we're naming what exists naturally and objectively. Oftentimes when we talk about knowing students, the commitment is, the belief is, I am, as a person, I'm a teacher, and I am using whatever tools at my disposal to be able to represent the student as an objective thing. So I am merely describing what the child is. In knowing students, I'm describing it. Right? And that's a very specific philosophical commitment. Right? And what I would argue is, and this connects to the idea of historical ontology. What I would argue is any effort to know students is actually an act of sense making, of giving form to them, of trying to constitute them as particular types of beings. And the word constitute is very important here. Because if you think about teachers, right? So if your teacher is making sense of students, right? We can use the word construct, but I don't think the word construct actually captures what's happening. Excuse me, because when I think of the word construct, I am creating this image of the student. I have this representation of the student. Um, and in that representation has no bearing on that student, right? So I'm constructing it, right? It's almost like a sole act or a solo act. When we use the word constitute, I am engaging in the process of constructing students. However, that construction, how I'm making sense of student, is actually impacting that student's sense of self, right? I'm helping render that person a particular type of being. And I'm going to give an example like later on, a little bit later on with grit. And that's why I think grit is really cool to think about. If no one is, if anyone's ever, if no one's been exposed to the notion of grit as a psychological character trait, right? Because it's a character. People call it a non-cognitive skill, a character trait, right? If you've never been exposed to that concept in that way, um, nor have been exposed to an evaluation of your grittiness, we do have these tools, these assessments, self-report scales. There's observation protocols, right? There's lots of different ways, right, to assess one's grittiness, right? So say you've never been exposed to it, that term, and as a psychological category or assessments, you may not have organized or made a sense of yourself as a gritty person. However, once you become exposed to it, right? Once I introduce you to grit as a character trait and I ask you, are you gritty? Right? Or once I give you an evaluation, right? A self-report scale that says if you do XYZ, then you're gritty. If you do XYZ, then you're gritty. Before to that, you didn't use grit as an organizing psychological category. You didn't use it to make sense of yourself. However, once we're confronted with this language, that becomes then a reference point for evaluating and thinking about ourselves. Right? And that's what constitution means. It means I'm using historically, culturally, ideologically bound language and tools to make sense of you. And in that act of making sense of you, you are confronted with these tools, these languages, these concepts, and use it as a reference point for your identity. Now, it's not deterministic because always, if I make sense of you a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to internalize and be that, although it can be, right? It can be deterministic, but it cannot be. So one could resist that labeling, those tools, right, that assessment, that evaluation, but the point is now though that language, those tools, those assessments become reference points for you to think about yourself, and you may internalize it, and one may take a grit scale and say, oh, this grit scale told me I'm gritty, and that may inform your identity. I'm sure lots of folks have taken the Myers-Briggs personality test. And if you have, and it said you're a certain whatever, that may inform your identity. You may say, this is what I am. So at times, the confrontation with those efforts of knowing, naming, labeling, identify, sometimes a confrontation with that really stick with us and come to inform how we understand ourselves. And it may shape how we relate to others. It may shape how we interpret experience, right? It may become a very foundational, important part of who we are. But some folks may not. Some folks can say, no, I'm sorry, I don't give credibility to this. Doesn't reflect me. I don't even believe in personality anyway. Right. So, right. Somebody could say that. Right. But again, right. But now they're reflecting on thinking about, am I this? Am I not that? Right. And that becomes a reference point for thinking about themselves. That happens in schools. Right, it happens in schools so many different ways. We're using so many different concepts, tools, measurements, right, to make sense of kids, and this is affecting how they understand themselves, how they relate to themselves. So this is, I think some folks did a really nice job with capturing some of the points from the chapter. So I'm just going to quickly review them, right? So it said, according to Vassallo, education psychology frames knowing students as a necessary component of teaching because conventional ed psychologists believe that there is something inherent to students that can be known, right? And so the critical ed psych commitment is that there is not something inherent to students that can be known. We're not describing them, right? Right. And so critical ed psychologists or historical ontologists would use the word ascribing, right? And an effort to know students is an ascription, not a description. An ascription is right. So when we ascribe something, we are assigning characteristics to people based on based on the tools we have and the interpretation of the behaviors and their thought processes. So we're giving form to them through the use of tools and language in the interpretation of their behaviors in our relationship with them. Thus, the idea that knowing students can be free of any biases or socio-political influence is flawed. Flawed. Yes, that's right. Right, and there could be lots of biases, right? But not even just biases, right? Just like social political influences, some that are just beyond our awareness and recognition. There could be cultural influences, political influences, philosophical influences, right? But just the idea is there's no such thing as knowing students in a way that's free from any type of context. So neoliberal ideology is responsible for the emergence of the imperative to know students because being able to know students implies that there is a scientific process by which teachers can measure students' ability, grit, perseverance, intelligence, character, and other traits. Really cool point. The only thing I would say here is not that necessarily neoliberal ideology is responsible for it. However, right, I would say that neoliberal ideology contributes to how we're knowing students, right? It also, I would say, yes, it absolutely contributes to the application of the scientific method to knowing students, but also I would say it would contribute to the ways in which we know students, the concepts we use, right? And so the student really talked about right now we want to know students, their levels of grit. We want to know their growth mindset. We want to know their levels of creativity, right? We want to know what else do we want to know? Oh, risk taking. Yes. Do we want to know if they're entrepreneurial, innovative, right? Like these are the things we care about. These are the things we want to know about. These are the things we're evaluating. These are the things we're trying to cultivate, right? And neoliberal, I would argue that the thrusts of that, right, of knowing students in that way, very much informed by neoliberal ideology. And absolutely, definitely the idea that we can know, that we can apply the scientific process to know students, I would definitely connect that with neoliberal ideology as well. But I think, see, the thing is, the reason why knowing students can be accepted so readily by so many people is because it appeals to so many different ideological commitments. So there are those who are more humanistic, democratic, even some critical pedagogues would say we have to know students. Um, and so it's a highly appealing pedagogical imperative that can actually be aligned with lots of different ideologies or visions for schooling and visions for persons. And that's why things like that imperative are very hard to resist. And be critical of because of that broad appeal. This is another log post. Teachers can easily attempt to know their students by identifying categories and descriptions that best fit that student. That's an interesting wording too, right? That best fit the student, because sometimes you might say, "Hey, I'm being a good knower of students because I'm not seeing everyone the same way or applying the same frameworks." Although I'd argue that we probably are, right? But I'm individualizing this knowing students, right? And we might argue that that is a safer ethical position um, than trying to explicitly apply a framework to all students. But again, going back to that point, like, say, even if we use multiple intelligences and there's 8 different intelligences, right? We have 8 intelligences. We've got to try to fit everyone on one of these, right? So again, even though you're individualizing to a sense, there's still a homogenized, universalized framework on which you're trying to get everybody, right? And so what if there what if we come down the line and there's like 20 different intelligences, right? Or I mean, what if the intelligence framework doesn't even make sense at all? um, or what if what if somebody that's I'm trying to think I mean, I'm trying to think of a so I was recently thinking of the notion of the whole child. Part of teaching the whole child means helping them develop themselves emotionally. Right? Their emotional development has to be integrated in schools. And I just wondered, I thought, why would somebody want to construe me as an emotional being, especially one who has to have their emotional expressions to be developed and regulated? Like, I wouldn't want to be construed as an emotional being, not emotional as in well, I'm very emotional, but as I'm using it in terms like don't I wouldn't want to be constructed as someone who has like this emotional component that needs to be integrated into an educational space. And that's just me, right? I wouldn't want to feel that way. Um, and so for someone to then take that up into the educational space, aside from not giving me a choice, right? You're not giving me a choice. If I don't want to be construed and as an emotional being, I don't want my emotion to be regulated by some institutional objective. I don't have a choice, right? Because the whole child push, if I left that out, then I wouldn't be teaching the whole child. And so, as someone who's committed to teaching the whole child, I have to do this, right? I have to construct someone as having this emotional part, and I have to integrate that into the schooling space, and I have to make sure that the emotion is expressed in a certain way and develops in a certain way. I wouldn't be a big fan of that. Right? And this goes to power. Who gets to decide what people are, right? What they are, what the characteristics are, and what they should look like, right? That's the power. There's a lot of power, implications of power in knowing students. Teachers are in a really cool position, not a cool, but interesting position of authority, right? To get to articulate, to know, to state, frame, calibrate what students are, right? And one of the issues that I raised in the chapter was what representation gets gets validated the most. Do students' representation of selfhood, what they are, does that get recognized? The parents' representation get recognized. Teachers, ministry, like whose representation of the person gets seen most valid. Now you might say, well, let's integrate them all to be more fair. Um, and in doing so, we can get a whole picture of what persons are. I can see that as a better ethical position than just taking one voice over other, but I can over others. But I can see lots of issues with that as well. Anyway, let's go back to this. So Vassal is arguing that it's important to recognize that these concepts are subjective, emerge from specific moments in time, and support specific ideologies that are often aligned with neoliberalism. So yes, and I would argue, and sometimes there are ways of knowing students that don't align with neoliberalism, right? But I would argue, though, that within schools today, we are seeing a lot of like the tools, instruments, ways of thinking about knowing students, the concepts we're using are informed by neoliberal ideology. But again, it's trying to situate ways of knowing students within a ideological context. Again, not saying it's good or bad yet. So grit is one way to know students, right? This is one of the ways in which I would argue is informed by neoliberal ideology. This is something that's growing a lot of popularity, and there's a lot of effort to formalize instruction, right? to foster grittiness in students. KIPP is a charter school knowledge is power program. It's a charter school organization that explicitly frames their teaching as cultivating grit, although one can debate whether or not it actually does it. But grit is now one way to know students, right? We have to measure students' grit. We have to figure out if they're gritty, and then we have to figure out how to create context to cultivate their grittiness. And so I was going to have you fill out this, right? Based on, I was going to provide you a definition of grit, would you say you're gritty or not? Again, this was me trying to provide an example of the constitution of selfhood, of identity, of being, by asking you, are you gritty? Right now, that becomes a reference point, concept of you to make sense of your experience. Now you might go back, like, oh, okay, all right. So did I do X? Did I do Y? Did I do Z? How often did I do that? And so now this notion of grit becomes this anchor, this reference point for you to evaluate your experiences, your tendencies, your habits, your dispositions, and say, all right, yeah, maybe I'm gritty. Yeah, maybe I'm not so gritty. Yeah, maybe sometimes, right? Right. And now this has become a part of who you are. Now, if it stays as part of how you make sense of yourself, then you're going to interpret new experiences in terms of your grittiness, right? And you might do something, right? And say, oh, yeah, that wasn't so gritty of me. Oh, yeah, that was pretty gritty of me, right? And now it becomes this anchor point for making sense of yourself. And so the points, right, I think relate to grit, particularly grit is a category. It's a category used to mark identity. I'm using it to say you are this or you are not this, right? Now, again, from a historical ontological perspective, grit is not a natural category of persons. It serves as a reference point to interpret experience, both to interpret past experience and future experience. Also, think about the function. Think about the function of knowing students, right? We philosophically would say, all right, can we know students? Is this really a part of persons, right? But also think about what does the identification of person as gritty do, right? And grit can serve as a sorting tool, right? We tend to, at least rhetorically, value grit. Because I would argue we actually, and we can talk about this in class next week, I would actually argue that we don't really, teachers, administrators, policymakers really actually don't want gritty people. Even though it's treated as a highly valued character trait, non-cognitive skill. And if it's a highly valued character trait, non-cognitive skill, if we can identify who's gritty, then we can say, all right, this person is gritty, has the traits we want. This person should get access to positions that require grit, right? Whereas this person's not gritty, all right, this person has to do something else, right? So it can be served as a sorting tool. Of course, determine who has good character. Right? It's been normalized. If you're gritty, you're good. If you quit, you're bad, right? Generally, right? That's a little oversimplistic, but it's really, that's part of the narrative, right? I think the grit narrative, it's also, I think, a broad cultural narrative. Grit can be used to decide who needs an intervention to reform their character, right? If you're not gritty, if I determine that you are not gritty, I need to work on you to change you in some way. Grit also aligns with a specific way of thinking about opportunity and causality, right? The idea of grit has to do with, if I do something, if I am a certain way, I can be successful in life, right? It's part of that neoliberal emphasis on responsibilizing persons for their own life outcomes and predicaments, by the very choices that they make. Effort is a choice, arguably, right? The amount of effort you exert, your perseverance, these are arguably choices. If you make good choices, if you exert lots of effort and persist, right, you'll be successful, right? That's the grit promise. And that, I would argue that that's actually a foundational message that comes out of neoliberalism. It's a very problematic message. So general ideas about knowing students, right? And actually, I'll just project those and you could pause there and just review these, right? And This really speaks to this helps to just, I guess, emphasize or remind you of the idea that knowing students is an act of giving shape or form to them, right? So if we go here, ways of constructing students, if we go, oh, sorry, come back here, whichever point, ways of constructing students give shape to them, right? So we can construct students, but once that construction becomes part of that relationship, right, and it impacts their being, then, right, then we can use the word constitution. Then we can say we're constituting them, students of particular types of beings, through the act of construction. And the ways in which we construct them is bound to instruments, concepts, tools that are culturally, philosophically, historically specific. Right? So there's no such way as a neutral value-free way of knowing students. Now, does it mean that we don't know them? No. Right? But it can mean lots of different things. Right? But if we start to denaturalize certain ways of knowing students, right, we could at least try to, in our practice, mitigate some of the effects of or dangers of knowing students. Go back to grit, for example. If one assumed grit was a natural category of persons and that it was the key to success in life, they're going to construe folks, they're going to construe folks as gritty, intervene in order to cultivate grittiness, right? That can help to communicate messages of personal responsibility, right? Now, so this, right, those messages, there are some students who arguably would resist that message. And so if you think about like your teacher, communicating that message, that could potentially create just general resistance from that student, maybe a distrusting relationship, saying, oh, this teacher is promoting an ideology of self-blame for my own life predicaments, right? And so that way of, just that way of knowing students can have these possible consequences, and awareness of that can help mitigate that. Log post, by recognizing historical conditions that contribute to knowing students. I love this. The ontological certainty can be cast into doubt, and students can potentially be constructed in different ways. So one, I think by recognizing the historical, political, ideological, cultural context of knowing students, we can start to resist certain things, certain ways of knowing it. Like we could open up whole new possibilities, whole different ways for relating to students, to think about students, right? But that might not have been possible otherwise if we naturalized certain ways of knowing students. If we believed intelligence was a natural category and that there were multiple ones, and someone had to fit in one of the 8 intelligences, that's going to limit how we understand folks, how we interpret them. Right? We're going to try to say, we're going to look for, all right, is this person displaying this type of intelligence, or this one, or this one, or this one, right? We're going to try to put them, right, identify and label them in a particular, with using a particular category. Learning styles. Learning styles is another problematic framework. If we try to situate people within or identify them as a particular learning style, right? It's going to shape how we interpret them, how we interact with them, the possibilities, the pedagogical possibilities. If one thinks that one's only a visual learner, you're going to try to emphasize visual forms when psychologists would say, actually, no one, and this is part of the problem with learning style, psychologists would say that people may have a preference for a format for learning, but it doesn't mean they learn better in that format. So if someone says, I'm a visual learner, psychologists would argue that is a preference, not a statement of fact for how they process information better. It's for one, it's a people process information all the time using all visual, auditory, kinesthetic. We're always using those things. Um, but just because one may have a learning preference, it doesn't mean they can't learn, or they don't learn better in a preference that they did not articulate. So if one says they're a visual learner, it doesn't mean that they can't learn better in a kinesthetic way, right? But if we were committed to that framework and say, all right, someone's a visual learner, so let me give them a whole bunch of visuals, right? That does not mean that they will learn better in that way. So anyway, so I like this, right? Recognizing historical conditions that contribute to knowing students, we can start to denaturalize certain frameworks, concepts, tools, and we can start to imagine students in different ways. We can relate to them in different ways, open up new pedagogical possibilities. So when it comes to knowing students, what do you plan to do, right? So if you're going to be a teacher, create policy, work with children in a therapeutic sense, right? We've had all those different interests expressed in our course. Taking into account, what do you plan to do? How might you mitigate some of these potential problems, dangers? And I want you to actually think about this. I want you to make progress toward your midterm assignment and think about it using this prompt. When it comes to know my students, or a child in the therapeutic setting, or when it comes to structuring a school, how are you going to handle this topic? In the structure of your school, you might have a philosophy that teachers need to sort of follow about knowing students. How would you frame it? How would you structure it? What would you want your teachers to do in the context of knowing students? In your lesson plan, right? If you have to know something about students, what are you going to do? What are the dangers? What are the consequences? How are you going to treat it? Even if you think, and you can absolutely take the position that people have inherent qualities and characteristics, but I'd want you to, in your articulation or in your creation of the lesson plan or policy, whatever, I'd want you to engage with that counter narrative. You don't have to believe the narrative, but I want you to engage in the counter narrative. So you say, I believe students have these natural dispositions. I believe they're naturally gritty or not, but I understand that there's this counter narrative. But my philosophical view is way better. It's gonna, for X, Y reason, and I'm going to use it to inform, this structure, decision making, whatever. So think about what you're going to do. How are you going to take some of these complexities into account? Yeah. So just to review, look forward. So again, I just want to highlight that I'll just do a quick statement of my argument. So I'm not, well, more than a statement. I'm not trying to say students are anything, right? I'm not looking to say, well, students are gritty or not gritty. Students have growth mindset or don't. There's a whole child or there's a part child, right? I'm more interested in what are the ways in which we construct students, and how does ideology, politics, and culture make those ways of constructing them possible? Right, and that's the historical ontological commitment. It's saying, right, it's bracketing that question. Right, remember, ed psychologists, that's what they want to do. They want to say persons are X, Y, Z, and if we do X, Y, Z, we can help to shape those things and develop those things and inform those things. Where critical ed psychologists are trying to say, well, how are we making sense of people? What are the language, tools, concepts? What makes it possible to develop truth claims about persons? Right, and when we talk about knowing students, that's what it is. It's a truth claim. If I say I have to know you, it's I am forming a truth about what you are. What is it? What are the context that enable me to make those truth claims, that give validity to those truth claims? Okay. So next week it's all right. So the last 2 weeks we've really been very heavy philosophical, right? Very. kind of looking at big picture stuff, looking at some complex issues, right? Ed psychology, critical ed psychology, social justice, knowing students. We're going to start getting to more of the more traditional ed psych stuff next week. So we're going to be focusing on information processing theory. I would argue, again, as I said earlier in this presentation, is all of ed psychology is about knowing students. And one of the ways in which we can know students is how they process information. How do they remember stuff? How do they form memories? How do they remember those memories? And information processing theory is a very useful theory for helping to explain that. And it's also going to be a very useful theory for helping to think about teaching and structuring classroom pedagogy. We are reading a chapter by Ormrod. Ormrod is, and it's a chapter from a educational psychology textbook. So you'll notice a very different tone to this text. It's very declarative type information, trying to say, hey, these how things are. This is how memory works, and this is how you teach based on how memory works. Lots of cool examples. Very interesting. So you'll be reading that. I think you'll find it probably a little bit refreshing from some of the more denser things we've kind of read thus far. So when you're reading information processing, they really focus on the components of memory and what they do. Right? There's things such as sensory register, working memory, long-term memory. Think about attention, the role of attention in memory. Think about what contributes to people remembering stuff. Why do people forget? Right? Think about the processes and mechanisms of the information processing model. So there's just that one reading. I want you to do a reading log, and of course, you'll have a knowledge check. If you have any questions about things we've talked about, send me an email, or we could talk about that stuff. We can review some of this stuff next week. Thank you.